The wedding feast at Cana, the real story. I really don't need this at my time of life. To be locked up in a Roman drunk tank is really too shaming. I wouldn't mind, but I only wanted to enjoy myself at a family wedding. For me, Mary, a respectable widow and the Mother of God, to be dragged away like a common criminal is just too ridiculous. I should never have went to that marriage feast, and I don't care if I never set foot in that dumb Cana again. Everything was going on quite respectably until that incident involving turning the water into wine. Me and my big mouth, why couldn't I just leave it button for once? Did it matter if the wine had run out? Most of the guests were already half drunk anyway. John the Baptist had already got sick in the corner. I told him that mixing wine with locusts was a bad idea. So here am I, hungover, lying on the floor in a Roman jail, with Jesus snoring in the corner, propped up against the wall. That black eye he's got is going to look really bad for the next week or so. So, you may ask, how did all this come to be? It all started around 3 weeks ago, when we received the invitations to young Judith's wedding in Cana. She was marrying Josephat, a young shepherd from Capernaum. I wasn't too excited about going, and I hoped my mother, St. Anne, wasn't going to be there. St. Anne had fallen out with Judith's mother, Martha, many years ago. She suspected that Martha had shopped at the tax collector's when she'd opened a little shop around the time that Jesus was born. While I was pondering all these problems in my heart, who should walk in but the redoubtable St. Anne herself? She had got an invite to the wedding as well. According to my mother, Martha and her were best buddies again. They'd made up at John the Baptist's bar mitzvah, apparently. My enterprising mother was even going to use some of her connections to supply the wine for the wedding feast. When I heard that, I got a slight sinking feeling. My mother's enterprises seldom went without hitch. Now, I'm not going to say the grandmother of the Saviour of the world was a crook, because she wasn't. But she just couldn't resist a bargain, and she was a prime target for every dodgy Syrian conman or a Sumerian wide-buy around. And if St. Anne said she was going to use one of her contacts to get you something, you could bet your bottom shekel that there would be something wrong with it. So 3 weeks later, Jesus, my mother and me are in Cana. There was a big crowd at the synagogue. Half Galilee seemed to have turned out for the wedding. Of course, St. Anne and Martha had identical veils. This didn't go down too well with either of them. John the Baptist turned up wearing what looked like the skin of a moth-eaten goat. This didn't go down too well with anyone. The rabbi preached for what seemed an interminably long time. I thought he'd never shut up. I just wanted to get to the reception and get at the food. We didn't have time to get anything to eat before the wedding, due to the donkey, which had been supplied by my mother's good friend, Slippery Simon, losing 2 shoes just outside Nazareth. I was not in the best of moods at that wedding ceremony. I was starving, and I still had the feeling that something was bound to go wrong. Jesus, of course, displayed his usual divine insouciance in the face of all irritations. Sometimes my son and Redeemer could be very annoying. It didn't help to see my mother and Martha throwing bad looks at each other all the time. I could hear St. Anne muttering something like, "The nerve of that woman, and why couldn't she get her own veil?" I knew that the so-called exclusive that my dear mamma thought she was wearing came from Slippery Simon, and his exclusive creations were on every market stall in the entire Roman Empire. Eventually, the synagogue part was over, and we all went back to Martha's house for the wedding feast. There was the usual trouble about finding locusts for John the Baptist. There's always one awkward guest at functions. If it's not a veggie, It's probably an eccentric prophet that eats only locusts. This is when I warned Cousin John about the perils of wine on a stomach lined only with desert insects. But he wouldn't listen to me, with the inevitable consequences. He'd lose his head someday, that boy. The food wasn't bad. I had some fatted calf, and Jesus had some loaves and fishes. My mother criticised everything about the wedding reception, but she still managed to put away quite a lot of food and wine. Cousin John crunched on his locusts and drank copiously from a large jug of wine. You should never invite a prophet straight from the desert to a wedding. That's only asking for trouble. I was starting to get very uncomfortable, and I kind of wanted to go home. The Baptist was getting a bit raucous. He was saying indiscreet things about King Herod and his second wife Herodias. I thought we ought to be getting away before there was any trouble. The final straw came from me when the drunken prophet interrupted proceedings to make a speech congratulating the happy couple, and then turned into the corner and spat at the wall with a mess of half-digested locusts and red wine. Right, I said to Jesus, find your granny and let's get out of this dump. Before we saw her, we heard her. She was in a huge row with Martha about the wine. Don't blame me, she was shouting. Slippery Simon swore to me that he would supply 30 large jars of wine. I don't know why you've only got 10. Knowing you, Martha, you probably sold the other 20. And why couldn't you get your own veil, you copycat cow? When people get to hear about this, Anne, Martha was shouting back, your name will be mud, just like your scraggy old face is now. And I didn't copy your head rag. Mine is designer Alexandrian. Yours is just some market stall knockoff rubbish. You always were so common, you old bag. Jesus had to step between them. Typical families, always fighting. I decided we couldn't go just yet. St. Anne might be an embarrassment sometimes, but she was my mother. I called Jesus into a corner. Son, I said, we can't leave things like this. The honour of our whole side of the family is at stake. I know that you could sort it out if you wanted to. So please, for me and your old granny, make some wine. What has it to do with me, woman? He said. My time has not yet come. And you are not too old to feel the back of my hand, I said. All right, mother. Only for you. He had a word with the head steward, and the next thing I noticed was they were filling all these big jars with water from the well. Draw some out and give it to the bride's father to taste, Jesus said. Judith's father was absolutely gobsmacked. That's brilliant wine, he said. Where did it come from? John the Baptist propped himself up on one elbow. My super cousin, Jesus, did it, he said. Then he fell back into his corner and started snoring loudly. Of course, the party really got going then. Since Jesus was the hero of the hour, we decided to stay on for the evening. 4 hours later, and about 8 beakers of the new wine, and I was ready for anything. Let's go and rouse the Romans, St. Anne said. Oh, that sounds like great fun, dearest Anne, Martha said. They'd made up again, apparently. Yeah, let's go and shout bad things at the oppressor, I shouted as well. Come on, Jesus. No, it's not really my thing, he replied. I'm not drunk enough for that silliness. Okay, stay here, pussy, I shouted as the 3 of us ran out the door. There was a small Roman garrison in Cana. I think there were about a dozen soldiers in it altogether. Luckily for us, they only understood Latin, because the things we were shouting outside the windows in Aramaic would have got us all stretched on crosses before morning, if they'd understood a word. The names to be called Tiberius and his governor Pontius Pilate would have made an Egyptian temple prostitute blush. Eventually, just because they wanted to get some rest, 6 Roman soldiers came out and dragged myself, Mary the Mother of God, my mother, St. Anne, and Martha into the fort. They bundled us into a cell to sober up. So that brings us to the start of the story again. Jesus was in the cell because he asked the Romans if he could sleep there to keep an eye on us. You people probably think that Jesus got a black eye because he was brawling too. That's not what happened at all. He got to shine up when he tried to wake up John the Baptist. It seems that the voice crying in the wilderness thought he was being attacked and bashed his divine cousin before he really realized who he was. The following day, to my great surprise, the Romans let us go. I'd been expecting a scourging at least, but they were very polite and apologetic. They even waved at us as we left. I suspect my son and his miraculous powers may have had something to do with it, but I'm keeping my mouth shut from now on. Oh, one thing I wanted to ask you, Jesus, I said as we rode off. Who was that kid in the corner at the wedding who was writing everything down? Oh, that was John the Evangelist, he said. He's documenting my life for a book he's writing. Well, son, I think you need to have a word with him about this bit in Cana. He will need to do some creative writing here.